Hey kiddos, so today we're going to talk about the War of 1812 and how that helped the United States expand a little bit, but we're going to spend most of our time talking about the details of the war and what events unfolded and what were the results of the war. The last thing we talked about was how France and Great Britain were constantly fighting, and the United States didn't want to get involved. But we ended talking with the fact that the United States will eventually become involved in the War of 1812. So, this is the information about that. The war against Great Britain finally began in the year 1812, and it would last 2 years until 1814. By the end of the war, neither side who was involved would accomplish any of the reasons for starting the war. For example, the United States wanted to take advantage of the fact that Great Britain was fighting with France and not really too involved in Canada. So the United States wanted to invade and conquer Canada. But every time the Americans tried to invade, they would end up being defeated by the British. I'm kind of going to recap just quickly or summarize quickly about what the war was about, but we will be talking in more detail. Great Britain landed in the United States in Maryland in 1814. So for those 2 years, they had been fighting in Canada and in areas around. But Great Britain finally came to the United States in 1814. They attacked Washington, D.C., they burned down the White House, and in those events, the government officials all left the White House. They didn't want to be there to be conquered. They didn't want to be hurt or anything in the invasion. And the First Lady, who was President Madison's wife, was able to collect some important documents from the White House before it burned down. For example, she saved the cabinet papers, so all of the notes that the president and his officials or his advisors had come up with. She was able to collect those and save them. And she also saved George Washington's portrait, which is pretty cool because that same portrait is still hung today in the White House. So, like I had mentioned, from 1793 to 1815, France and Great Britain were constantly at war. In between those years, they were always fighting in Europe. Most Americans wanted the United States to remain neutral. However, in 1810, there was a new election, and a new group of politicians was elected to Congress. And these group of men were called war hawks because they were really interested in gaining more land for the United States, which would probably have to do with or will result from taking action in war and taking land away from other countries. So these war hawks, these men, wanted to take the United States they wanted the United States to take Florida away from Spain, and they wanted to take away Canada from Great Britain. They were also angry at the fact that the British and the Spanish were helping native groups attack the Americans. So this was kind of like their revenge. Natives were uniting their tribes, and they were fighting against the new settlers who were occupying the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. So we talked about how the Americans are moving west and they're crossing the mountains, but they're landing or they're settling in land that was already owned by the natives. So the natives don't like this. They don't want to give up their land. They don't want to share their land with these new strangers. And they've decided to unite together to fight against the Americans who are settling there. So in 1811, the Americans sent a troop of soldiers to fight the natives in Indiana, and they defeated the natives in Tippecanoe, Indiana. Because of this defeat, the Warhawks wanted to defend American honor, so they declared war on Great Britain in 1812. So it became official in 1812. There was a group of states in New England who didn't want to get involved in the war, and instead of the War of 1812, they named it Mr. Madison's War because James Madison was the president during the time, and he's the one who declared war on Great Britain. So they refused to send their state's militia. So remember, we talked about how each state had its own group of soldiers. So the New England states didn't want to send their soldiers to fight in the war. They also went against the American orders and engaged in an illegal trade with Canada. Because Canada was a great British colony, the Americans didn't want to have any kind of business with Great Britain, so they forbade trading with Canada. But the New England states didn't really care, and they still participated in trading illegally with Canada. So once the war had started, the American Navy won some important victories for the American side, and this happened between the years of 1812 and 1813. Because of these victories, Great Britain was forced to retreat back into Canada. But when they were there, Great Britain decided to send 14,000 soldiers, and they invaded the United States in Maryland. Because there were so many soldiers, they were pretty unprepared for this invasion. The Americans left Maryland. They left that fort and they kind of like ran away. So they were pretty much conquered in that invasion. Great Britain was also angry at the Americans because they had burned down Canada's capital. So this is when they decided to burn down Washington, D.C. They burned down the White House. They burned down a lot of different important buildings that the government used for offices and where they kept important documents. After that, Great Britain captured a fort in Maryland near Baltimore, and it was called Fort McHenry. And there was an American soldier. His name is Francis Scott Key, and he was prisoner in a British ship. So he was watching this attack in the nighttime. He went to sleep, and then the next morning, he noticed that the American flag was still there. And if that sounds familiar, this is where we get the Star-Spangled Banner. So our national anthem comes from this battle because Francis Scott Key wrote a poem about how there was an attack on Americans and how they were not able to defeat the British in this battle, but the flag was still there, which meant they were still fighting for a chance to defeat the British. And that's where we get the Star-Spangled Banner from. In January of 1814, the Americans were led to another battle by Andrew Jackson, and there they defeated the British in the Battle of New Orleans. So this picture shows this is Andrew Jackson here. These are the British, and the Americans are defeating the British. Although a peace treaty had already been signed 6 days before this, but remember, the information doesn't travel fast back then. There wasn't internet or any kind of news to travel fast. So the Americans at this battle weren't aware that there was already a treaty in place, a peace treaty in place. So even though the war was technically over, Andrew Jackson became a national hero because he defeated the British. So that treaty that was signed ended the war. It ended in 1814. No one really won. There wasn't a winning side to this war because everything basically went back to normal. The Americans, the Spanish, the British, the French, all their affairs went back to normal. The only losing side was the natives because since they had been defeated, they were forced to sign their land away. And little by little, we're going to talk more about how the natives are being pushed out of their land. and the Americans are taking over. The War of 1812 kind of kept this American independence, and it gave the Americans a sense of patriotism, and they were proud to be Americans. And those who were not really in favor of the war started to lose power. So if you were a government official and you opposed the war, people didn't really want to vote for you anymore. And for a period of time, there was only really one national political party, which kind of showed how united the Americans were. And this period became known as the era of good feelings. A few years later, in 1818, Florida was still a Spanish colony. So Spain was in charge of Florida down here. All of this is the US, remember the first 13 colonies, then when they started moving west, and then all this land that came from the Louisiana Purchase. So this part here, okay, and all the green over here is owned by Spain. Andrew Jackson, the same person who defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans, led an attack and invaded Florida. And his excuse or his claim was that he was chasing natives that attacked Georgia, and Georgia's here. So he invaded Florida using that claim, and Spain agreed to sell Florida to the United States. And this treaty is known as the Adam-Onis Treaty of 1819. So in 1819, the United States gained Florida, and now this is part of the United States too. In 1822, or by that year, Spain had lost most of its colonies, so it didn't really have control of a lot of its land anymore. In 1823, the new American president named President Monroe, he issued the Monroe Doctrine, which was a law that did not allow the U.S., or the U.S. did not allow any European country, so whether it was England, France, Spain, any country from Europe, could not come to the Americas and set up a new colony anymore. The doctrine also said that the U.S. wouldn't interfere with any colonies that were already here. So, for example, this land over here, they wouldn't deal with it anymore. So it was already there. They weren't going to get involved. They also were not going to get involved with any other European affairs. So this was kind of a warning to all the other European countries that if they were at war, the United States did not want to get involved. And that kind of shows how the Americans are going to be more invested or interested in just keeping their country running and expanding, because in the next few lessons we're going to talk about how all this land is going to get it's going to become explored and more part of the United States. Okay, so for this lessons activity, there is a worksheet about the War of 1812 and the Monroe Doctrine. So you're just going to answer these 6 questions. You can answer on a separate document, or if you want to write it in your notebook, take a picture of it. But you can also use the PDF and the text tools to write on this one. Okay? And that's it. Talk to you later.